Welcome to Australian Hiker, your online hiking resource. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage.
This is episode 150 of the Australian Hiker podcast. In today's episode, we're interviewing Liz Byron, who in 2004 undertook an epic journey on the Bicentennial National Trail, which runs between Cooktown in Queensland to Healesville in Victoria, a distance of around 5,300 kilometres. This is Australia's longest shared trail and is accessible to hikers, long-distance horse trackers and cyclists. Liz's journey took in the northern half of this trail, and over 7 months she covered approximately 2,500 kilometres. Where her journey is unique is that she did it with the aid of donkeys, Grace and Charley, to carry her equipment. This is truly an inspiring story and one that is well worth listening to. This is one of our longer podcast episodes, but it is unique. So if you have an interest in the Bicentennial National Trail or hiking with pack animals, this is certainly an interesting one. And I must admit, I learned more about donkeys than I ever thought possible, and I found it really interesting. So we hope you enjoy today's episode. Today we are catching up with Liz Byron, 15 years after her epic journey, to talk about her amazing trip as well as her recently released book, The Only Way Home. Liz, thank you for taking the time to talk with Australian Hiker.
You're welcome, and I'm delighted to be here.
Okay, now before we start on the trip itself, tell us a bit about your hiking background. You know, what sort of hikes have you done in the past, and what's your hiking involvement?
Okay, well, hiking to me is the one word that covers my two great loves, and that's bushwalking in Australia and long-distance trekking anywhere you like. But bushwalking was where I started. I started in the late 1960s, bushwalking with my husband, and we had a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old in tow at that time when we began. We soon progressed to overnight bushwalking, carrying ridiculously heavy packs, and in those days there were no external frame packs, let alone internal frame. All the weight was on the shoulders. But we were carrying weights for, children as well as adults. But so it was very much, bushwalking for me was connected with family. Our 4 children, in fact, grew up bushwalking through the 1970s, when it was quite rare to see a family's bushwalking with children. Because it was so rugged. It was much less crowded than it is today, and certainly no boardwalks, things like that. But we often had the kids' friends with us. So when we occasionally came across other bushwalkers, our group attracted a lot of interest and comments about how well the kids managed on rough, steep tracks.
All right, now, and I believe you were, when we were setting up this interview, I believe you've done a reasonably big track in the Himalayan region. Yes,
so as well as bushwalking in Australia, so from my my late 20s until my 50s, it was primarily Australian bushwalking. But when I was 50, my husband and I did a 6-week expedition to Mera Peak in the Himalaya. Mera Peak's at 6,500 metres, with a fine view of Everest. You feel very much as if you're right up there. It's in fact the highest peak in the world that one can walk to without technical climbing gear. All we needed was crampons and ice axes. But when I had finished that trek, the trek was over, but I didn't want to stop. I could have walked forever. I felt as if I just wanted to spend the rest of my life walking like this. And by this time, my children are all adults with their own lives. So I'm thinking about what I wanted for my life from that point on.
Okay, so now getting on to the trip we're talking about today. So it sounds like roughly in around about the early 2000s, you decided you wanted to do a long trek. How did you decide you were going to do an adventure of this size, and why did you choose this particular trip?
Well, the first bit about an adventure of this size absolutely comes back to that Mirror Peak trip, because, yes, I wanted to just keep walking forever, but it was time to go back to Australia and time to put a full pack back on my back again, because there were no Sherpas in Australia for carrying your pack. The adventure of this size really derived directly from the Mirror Peak expedition. The feeling of wanting to walk forever stayed with me, because by that time my kids were all grown up, so it was about my life and what I wanted to do sort of with my life. But to do that sort of walking in Australia, I had to come back to carrying my own pack. A heavy pack if you're going to do long distance stuff in Australia, it's nearly impossible. No, it's not impossible because people do it, but as I was getting older, it would have been pretty tough to walk, really long distances between supply outlets. So I put it on hold, really, until I discovered donkeys, in the sense of the idea of donkeys being able to carry my load. That just opened up a whole world for me. But my God, I can do a long distance trek in Australia with 2 donkeys and just carry a day pack. So that was the beginning of the adventure of this size. Yeah.
Why did you choose the Bicentennial National Trail?
Well, for fairly naive reasons, actually, because I'm not a good navigator. After 30 years, more than 30 or 40 years of bushwalking, my husband navigated. He was a very good navigator, and I loved not having to take navigational responsibility. But this was something that my husband wasn't going to be joining me, and I needed to find something that I could actually manage the navigation. So I understood the Bicentennial Trail to be a trail. I thought it might be a bit like the West Highland Way that I'd done in Scotland, which is all nicely signposted and very easy to follow. But it's not quite like that, as I found. But it had all these guidebooks, okay? There's 12 guidebooks for the whole of the trail. And so I thought, that's going to give me instructions. I'm not going to really need to do map and compass. I know how to do map and compass, but actually applying it on my own was really quite difficult. I'm just not, I've got deficit spatial skills.
Yeah.
So, but that was the National Trail. And so I made that decision, and then I decided I wanted to do, I'd done so much bushwalking in New South Wales and Victoria. I really had walked most national parks in New South Wales and Victoria that, okay, I might as well I'll try the Queensland section. And I then decided I can walk. I really wanted to walk to my new home, which is in northern New South Wales. So, but I decided, as I say, on this Queensland section, so I got myself trucked to Cooktown to walk from north to south. And the other reason it seemed like a good idea to walk from north to south was that starting particularly in the winter meant that it avoided walking facing the sun all day.
I must admit, it's something I never really seem to consider. It's sort of the direction of the sun is probably one of the least impacts on me choosing a direction of hike. And but I think I'm a rarity there. I think a lot of people do think about that. But yeah, it's just something that it wouldn't even come into my mind about where the sun was. So it's interesting to hear that.
Yeah, well, that's understandable. But when you just sort of look at the map, looking at like when I'm beginning, I'm just looking at the map of Australia and looking at the map of the Bicentennial Trail, and it's travelling so clearly north to south.
Yeah,
I think it just naturally comes to you. My God, you're walking in pretty much the same direction the whole time. And in the Queensland section, that is actually pretty true. Once you get south into New South Wales, especially once you get down in the Alps and such, the track goes all over the place. But really, mostly through Queensland, it is truly north-south direction. Not very often was I walking any other direction.
Okay.
Only very, very short periods. So it was actually a wise decision in that sense.
No, I must admit, if I ever look at doing it, I would start north and work south, but for other reasons rather than the sun. So it's interesting to hear. As I said, I hadn't actually thought about that aspect of it. Now, from a point of view of planning, so tell us a bit about the planning for this trip. Where did that start, and what did that look like?
Well, the planning began with the donkeys because I knew I had plenty of outdoor experience. I knew how to live outdoors. I had a lot of experience. But what I had no experience of was large animals of any sort, not cows, not horses, not donkeys. And so what I needed to do was, I firstly had to find my donkeys. Then I had to get to know them and get to feel confident. I wanted to feel confident before I set out with 2 donkeys. That was so the planning for 4, and I figured on 4 years.
Yeah,
I reckon 4 years would be enough time to be ready.
Okay, and I mean, you were saying that most of your other hiking in the past have been done with family, and particularly you mentioned we are having to cater for younger children, and often you're carrying their gear when they're particularly young. But how did actually having two pack animals with you impact on that? Did that change your planning process?
Oh, entirely. I mean, it was a different type of travel. It was, in one way it was the same, in the sense that what I was always looking for was lightweight, everything to be lightweight, because I wanted to minimise the amount the donkeys carried. And there was all the planning about the food, there was all that sort of thing. But for me, coming back to all those years of walking with young kids, and especially when they got older and they brought their teenage friends and things along, I often planned and cooked over a fire while we were bushwalking for 8, 10 people.
Yep.
So I had that kind of planning type. I knew how to do all that part. And yet there was a lot of things that were the same and drew on all of my years of bushwalking experience. My capacity to plan food and everything on equipment for such a trek really derived from all that experience planning and walking with kids and their friends, because often we had as much a group, sometimes as big as 10 people, and young adults, like teenagers who ate plenty.
Yeah.
So the planning was quite complicated, but I did it all around that. My husband was the navigator, but for the rest of it, pretty much it was my organisation. So I drew on all of that, but then applied it to the donkeys. So I still needed to consider always the weight of things. The donkeys could carry a maximum, I determined, 50 kilos would be the absolute outside for each of them.
Yep.
And the pack saddles, They were very good pack saddles, but unfortunately quite heavy. They were nearly 10 kilos each. So we come back to 40 kilos. So I still thought that was a bit much. So I really tried to keep their weight on each donkey to 35 kilos to what I could carry.
Yeah.
But with that, that weight, I could go without picking up supplies for 3 to 4 weeks.
That's a pretty good length of run without having to resupply. I think that's often, particularly when you're travelling as a person and having to carry everything. Really, the limit is probably about 10 days for most people. So 3 to 4 weeks is pretty good.
Yeah, and that's what I found. That was what was so exciting for me. So not only did I not have to actually carry it, but I could be out there for longer. All
right. So, what were the main challenges prior to you starting this trip? What were the things that you mentioned navigation being something, which is why you chose this particular trail. But what other challenges were there in planning this process?
Well, one of the big challenges was how to get us to Cooktown. That was a big one.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want to trust my donkeys to anybody to load. Donkeys are very, very intelligent animals. And so, the more intelligent a creature is, we know about human beings, the more easily traumatized they are. And the last thing I needed was for my donkeys to be traumatized by being, loaded or in an uncaring or unfriendly way. So trying to find someone was a huge challenge. And the first thing I did was I contacted a friend who I'd got to know through the donkey world, who'd moved to Herberton. And I rang him to ask him, well, how did you get your donkeys up with you? He said, well, I haven't got them yet. I've been waiting to find someone who can bring the donkeys. And he had 9 donkeys. So I said, okay, well, how about we jump in this together? I'll try and find a truck that will take all 11 donkeys and me. My friend said, yeah, fantastic. So that's what that was a really big logistical problem about how to do that.
Yeah, I must admit, it's in some respects the donkeys are making it easier because they're carrying your gear, but you can't just hop on a plane or get a bus up to where you're starting. You've got pack animals to consider as well.
Yes. And another difference, this is a bit of a digression, but another difference about having pack animals is that they can't, climb fences as necessary as we can as bushwalkers when we're on foot. You've always got to find an opening. You can't just, magically get over fences. So there are lots of little things that crop up when you're walking with animals.
Now, how did you decide how long the trip was going to take? In your book, which we'll talk about a bit later on, you were saying you took roughly around about 7 months. But did you have a time frame set for this trip, or it was going to take as long as it was going to take?
Yeah. Well, how I did that was I needed to know how far I had to walk first. So how was I going to do that? Well, there was all these guidebooks, as I mentioned. I think there's 7 covers the section I was doing, but that would have taken quite a long time to go through those and actually add it up. So I'm pretty good at estimating, much better at estimating, in fact, than calculating anything. So I looked at the map of Queensland and looked at how close the Bicentennial Trail kind of ran to the main road. And so I skimmed down the numbers on the main road, added a bit, and reckoned on 3,000 kilometres.
Yep.
Which was amazingly close, I have to say. As I mentioned, I've got this weird ability to estimate, because when I did finally add up all my kilometres from the guidebooks, it was 3,005 kilometres.
That's pretty good.
So how was that? I'm very, very pleased with myself. But basically, yes, so I figured at 3,000 kilometres or thereabouts, it was going to be about 9 months. And I needed to have that sense of some kind of time limit. You know.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you're working or not, retired or not. You can't make it a never-ending thing. At some point, you've got to come back to home and to the house and to family. So
yeah, and have an idea. Just how long are you going to be gone, sort of thing. Yes, it's that sort of stuff. So yes, another planning challenge was supplies. How am I going to do this? How am I going to manage to get the food I needed when I needed it? I'm vegetarian. I knew that I wasn't going to get the sort of food that I needed in country areas of Queensland. So how was I going to do this? And how was I going to make sure I wasn't carrying, just like bushwalking, you need to know you've got enough food, but you really do not want a gram more than you need. Anyone who's carried a pack knows that. So I worked out a system that involved a week's menu that I had 3 different 1 week menus that I could adapt, but they gave me, and I did it all on spreadsheets, and I actually bought it all from a supplier in Canberra, because when I left, I was actually living in Bungendore.
Yep.
So I had everything organised through a supplier in Canberra. It was actually Mountain Whole Foods. They were absolutely fantastic. They even stored for me things that I couldn't buy from them, because what I did was I would fax them my order about every 3 weeks or a month.
Yep.
And then have it delivered to the next point of collection. And I used post offices mostly to do that.
Yep.
I also would post ahead of me all my bulk foods, like something like Vegemite, cooking oil, those types of things. Some of the I did carry some supplements from donkeys. So I would decant those at my restock points, and then post that in another box to my next collection point.
Yeah, yeah.
And that whole system worked really, really well. My putting the food onto these spreadsheets worked well, because what I could do is I would just tick things or say my quantities, and the people filling the order would know if they were out of something, they knew where it belonged, so they would just fill it with something else.
Yeah.
So I didn't have any of this thing, oh, sorry, we're out of stock. So, yeah, and except for one hiccup, the system worked well the whole trip, really, really well.
Oh, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we'll move on to the donkeys. So you travelled with 2 donkeys, Grace and Charley, so 2 female donkeys. And by the end of the trip, you actually ended up with 3, and we'll talk about a bit more about that later on. Now, you mentioned the reason for the donkeys was to basically shoulder the load and act as pack animals, and that you chose 2 donkeys based on the amount of weight that you needed to carry and what they needed to carry. Right. But what additional preparation, we've talked briefly about that, but what additional preparation did you need to make in relation to travelling with 2 donkeys?
Well, it was firstly, as I said, getting to know them and getting to know them involved, getting them to being confident they would do whatever I asked them to do. And what that involved was just walking and walking and walking. As I mentioned, I lived near Bungendore, and the donkeys and I spent every weekend walking all over the place, just together, teaching, like having them, so they'll jump over things so that they would walk through water whenever I needed them to, across any bridges that might be a little bit scary. Just really always exposing them to whatever I could, things that sometimes equines can be afraid of, like silly things like plastic bags. Although unlike a horse, they won't run away from a plastic bag. They will stand perfectly still, though, and not necessarily want to walk past it. So I wanted to expose them to it as much as I possibly could, so that they were confident that I was not going to lead them into trouble. So that was really, what comes with that is this wonderful relationship. It's a very precious relationship with these animals. I mean, I say it over and over again. They don't have to do, these large animals do not have to do what we want them to do. They're big. They can do whatever they want. And when they will do what we want them to do, it's such a privilege. And the privilege comes with relationship as a rule, unless someone treats them badly and they do it out of fear.
So you mentioned that you had a particular carrying pack, or not a pack. What's the word I'm looking for here? The
pack saddle.
Pack saddle. Okay. And was that an easy thing to find, or was donkey pack saddles not a common thing in Australia?
They're definitely not a common thing in Australia. So that was, yes, I've got that. That's definitely one of my challenges. Okay, when I felt ready to have them, to actually load them, I had to then start to look for the equipment. I knew there was plenty of ways in which you could get it made, but I was hoping I could get it ready-made. And of all things, when I decided that, there was an advertisement in the Donkey Society Journal in New South Wales about 2 complete sets of donkey packing gear. Can you believe that? It came out like the week I decided it was time to look. And so I went to see the guy and I bought it. I can't remember the price, but I know it was a really good price. I might have been $500 for each set, but, what that had was the pack saddle, all the straps, which are the girth, the chest strap, everything to hold the saddle stable, the saddlebags.
Yep.
He even had tether 3-meter pieces of tether that you could hook onto these 2 great big metal spikes to be hammered in the ground. So when I stopped, I could just tether a donkey, and so easily. There were even what you put under the saddle blankets.
Saddle blankets, yep.
These wonderful saddle blankets made of canvas on the outside and underneath of sheepskin. And can I just add there, what was so fantastic about those was that I could use them under my sleeping mat. I could fold one as a sitting cushion and have the other one as a mat underneath. So because I'm a long-term meditator and I meditated still most days, so I would sit to meditate on my saddle blankets. And a really interesting thing about donkeys, you see, is that if I did that with a horse, I would smell like a horse. Right? Donkeys don't smell. They don't have a smell. They just smell like whatever they're eating. And I presume that's because they don't have oily coats. So that's my guess. They have, and the disadvantages for them of not having oily coats is that when it rains, when they get wet right through the skin.
Yeah.
So unlike dogs and horses that are protected from the rain, the donkey's not, because of course they evolved in the desert.
Yeah.
So they're quite different. But so all of that, I got all of that equipment. Coming back to that, I got all of that equipment from this one couple, and the man had actually made everything, and he did everything very well. It was done really beautifully. And when I was actually after I'd finished packing all the stuff in the car and he'd gone off somewhere, and his wife told me that they'd planned to go trekking with donkeys, and that's why he did it. He spent apparently several years actually manufacturing all this equipment by hand. And when they actually went on the trek, he discovered he didn't like donkeys. Poor man. So he was, according to the wife, he was quite paranoid that the donkeys were going to run off with their gear. Like, just they're going to lose the donkeys. And so she said he ended up carrying more in his pack than the donkeys carried because, if they run off, I'll lose my camera. If they run off, I'll lose blah. In the end, he got sick, obviously, because he really didn't like it.
Yeah.
And so I got the benefit. So wasn't it fortunate? I just thought that was amazing.
Yeah, I was going to say, the karma's definitely there. It's sort of, getting the right particular item showing up at the right time is pretty good.
That's right. And I look at this might be the right place to even mention the fact that I've hung on to it, even though my last trek now was 4 years ago, and I kind of know in my heart I won't be doing any more. I've had trouble letting it go. Sort of letting it go is sort of like letting go of one of the really most precious parts of my life. But the reality is I really do need to start thinking about who might be able to really make good use of my trekking gear. So I'm sort of putting that out there. Yeah,
it's definitely a unique pieces of equipment, isn't it? It's not as if you can throw it on a horse or anything else like that. So
no, that's right. But it's traditional. It's traditional horse style packing, by the way.
Yeah,
donkeys can carry far greater loads than the 50 kilos I was mentioning in those other countries where they actually pack them properly, which is basically on their bum, you know?
Yeah.
Because that's the strongest place on a donkey.
Yeah.
So that, and you can, that, you'll see them, they'll carry 100 kilos like that. I didn't really know that, to be honest, at the beginning anyway. And even if I did, I don't think I could have learnt very easily at that time, which was really before so much internet use, how to do it. So I was stuck with the conventional horse-type packing gear, and which is satisfactory as long as you be aware that it's not really their natural way of carrying stuff.
Yeah. All right. So what about food for donkeys? I mean, are donkeys basically horses, or do they have different food requirements?
They're very, very different from horses in their food requirements. In fact, horses thrive on a grassy paddock. Donkeys do not thrive on a grassy paddock. Donkeys are browsers. Like horses and cattle are what they call grazers. So when they're eating, they just sort of, they're like mowing a lawn. They just go backwards and forwards on the paddock until they finish. They don't go. But donkeys are closer to goats. They go a little bit of this and a little bit of that, according to what they actually need.
Yeah, yeah.
And in fact, a vet who is not just a specialist equine vet, he's a specialist equine vet who specialises in equine feed, which I found very interesting. I contacted him to ask him, do I need to take extra for the donkeys, or can they manage on the side of the road? And he told me a couple of things about that. He said, firstly, donkeys know what they need. Of all domestic animals, they seem to have retained that basic instinct to know exactly what they need. And he used an example, the story of some donkey or donkeys that were trucked, grew up in Victoria and were trucked to some part of Queensland. And when they got to Queensland and were let out on their area, the large area where they let out to, they went straight to a bush, a herb, some sort of rough bush, which is what they like, that actually contained the minerals that were missing in the soil where they came from.
Right.
They just know what they need. So what he said how to deal with that is when you see them when you're walking and you notice that they keep going for a particular plant as you're walking and you don't want to stop. Right, he said, try and look for where that plant is growing when you take your lunch stops and things like that.
Yeah.
So that you can actually let them out, give them 20 minutes on that food, that feed that they're looking for. So that's what I did. And when I finished getting close to the end of the trek, a couple of ex-stockmen that I met who knew donkeys and horses, said they have never seen such healthy-looking donkeys. So donkeys can live on the smell of an oily rag. It was just amazing. For 1,000 kilometres at one stage, they never saw a blade of green anything. And they just, yeah.
That's pretty good. I mean, I think that's always the issue when you're travelling with horses, that they do have. If you try and do that with a horse, you're gonna struggle. But it sounded like they're ideally suited for the trip that you were doing.
Oh yes, yeah. In fact, these two particular guys that I just mentioned, when they were saying a donkey would outlast a horse any time. In fact, they said they knew that, but had no idea that they could do so well as what they saw in my donkeys, who at this stage had walked almost 2,500 kilometres.
Yeah.
What they said, and I said, but surely you would have done that, done those sorts of distances in your driving days, and they said, yeah, we did, but with 48 men and 40 horses.
Yeah. I suppose you swap rotating horses through, and
horses cannot just go day in, day out like a donkey can. So, I found all that. I was fascinated by all that.
All right. Well, I'll actually skip ahead a question because it's sort of relevant at this time. So, listening to the way you're talking about the donkeys and in talking to you and setting up this interview, they definitely do seem to be while they're an equine animal, they definitely seem to have their own personalities. So, tell us a bit about what it's like to actually walk with donkeys. What do you do to convince them to walk with you, and what's the relationship like with them?
Well, I guess it's sort of like round the other way. If you've got the relationship, they don't need any convincing. So walking with them they've just got this beautiful energy, that's all I can say. And sometimes frustrating, because donkeys, for me, all over the world, from what I read, a donkey's pace is around 4 kilometres an hour. My two donkeys, neither of them met that. Charley liked to walk at around my pace, which is naturally around 6 or 7 kilometres an hour. I've got quite a fast walking pace. So, and as someone pointed out, Charley and I even kind of got the same length leg.
Yeah.
Both got long, skinny legs, whereas Grace was much more solid, shorter legs, and did not like to walk very fast at all. And would much rather walk at around 3 kilometres an hour. So we had some struggles over that, probably for the first, I don't know, how long, first half of the trip, there were struggles. Because the tireder I got, the more I wanted to walk at my pace. I did not want to stroll.
Yeah.
So there was struggles around that, but they, I guess, to really, I couldn't possibly explain it. I was able to explain it in writing, those struggles and how they got sorted. So if anyone's really interested, they should read my book on that one. But yeah, to actually be with them, there's something just, it's like perhaps a child walking with mother.
Yeah.
You know, just this feeling of security. In fact, one thing that I never did mention in my book, and I hope you'll allow me to mention on this interview, is that when a lot of the walking, probably the majority of the walking, we're on back roads, all right? There wasn't a lot of walking through the bush, and there wasn't much walking on main roads. Most of it was on back roads.
Yeah.
Often where I wouldn't see more than 1 or 2 cars a day. You know, sometimes none, but you know, but you can be sure there's one way I've discovered to make a car arrive, and that's to decide to empty my bladder on the side of the road.
Yeah, that's pretty normal.
Because there's no one around, and a car appears, a pop, you know, immediately. Yes.
Yep.
And really early in the piece, it was so obvious. The donkeys moved around me and hid me from the passing car. At first time it happened, I thought it was just coincidental. But it happened over and over again. And I found that very beautiful. I really did. Yes.
I was going to say, I think you were mentioning that really from a perspective of, you know, one of the big differences between donkeys and other animals, it is a partnership, it's not a domination.
Yes, absolutely. You've really picked that up. That's right. It is. You try to control donkeys, they kind of go, well, I'll do it my way. Or if you're trying to control them to such an extent that they think it must be scary. So, all right, I won't do anything till I know what's going on here. And to me, all this difference between donkeys and horses comes from the fundamental in their nature is that horses' reaction to fear is to run. Donkeys' reaction to fear is to stand still. That's not to say they can't be startled and kind of jump, you know.
Yeah.
But when something is really scary, they stand still. And it's interesting for me to see them in say, a grassy area or something, or, you know, just in the bush. They actually are surprisingly well camouflaged in most natural surroundings. I don't know how, but they are. So, whereas a horse is obviously not. A horse's capacity is to run and to run away. But my theory is that capacity, that inclination to stand still has meant they have evolved this intelligence to actually think through what is needed here, to think about what the problem is. You know, and like when we were crossing rivers, I would go down to the water and then we would stand for a moment and, okay, how are we going to do this? I'm thinking, this looks like a good spot to cross. You know, looks to me as if there's not too many rough, you know, difficult big round rocks underneath it that donkeys are going to find difficult, because the donkeys have got really tiny hooves, remember.
Yeah.
So some of these things are really not in their nature to walk through mud, not in their nature to walk through, you know, slippery round stones.
Yeah.
But then I'd stand there and then Grace would kind of they look down at the water, then she turned her head to the side. I don't know what she was doing when she did that, but she always did that. So somehow or other, the placement of their eyes, I think, meant she was able to see the bottom. And then she'd sort of go, you know, she'd go, oh no, this isn't such a good spot. I'm going to move a couple of metres downstream. We're going to go across there. Whereas, you know, if you've got a horse that's, say, and you've got a difficult river crossing, then you just go, okay, now go, go, go. And the rider has to take responsibility for where the horse puts its feet.
Yeah.
For not hurting itself. The donkeys have got this great sense of self-preservation. And I guess when I've got this relationship with them, I become part of that which they want to preserve, I suppose.
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier on in the episode, we're going to be talking to Liz about her book in a few minutes' time, and there are some very good stories in there, particularly early on in the book where Liz talks about the process of loading donkeys onto a horse carrier, getting them up to Queensland. So I won't spoil the surprise, but it's well worth reading in the book and getting the details involved on that one. Now, what's become of Grace and Charley? Your walk was 15 years ago. It was in 2004, and you actually released your book earlier this year in 2020. So, what's become of Grace and Charley now?
Well, Grace died, and that was more painful for me, as equally as painful for me as the death of my son. Just more straightforward, that's all. I learned what just pure grief is through that. I didn't have, the complications of other children or whatever to manage. But it's a story that behind her death was just so unfortunate, because donkeys live a very long life, but naturally donkeys can live anything from 50 to 100 years. They don't tend to in Australia. You want to ask, especially in the New South Wales and Victoria, and that's, to me, it's bleeding obvious why. It's because most donkeys live on these grassy paddocks, which is like leaving a donkey like leaving a person in a sugar factory. Grace's death was just incredibly unfortunate. It was sort of like an accident, if you like, but I don't want to go into that right now. It's not something I can easily talk about. Because it's still just difficult to talk about. It's strange. I can talk more easily about the death of my son, but I guess that's because it was much longer ago. I still find it very hard about the way Grace died. So I was left with Charley, and I got another donkey then to try to see whether to give her the companionship. But she was so absolutely traumatised by Grace's death, and she never really would sort of befriend another donkey. So in the end, I had to let go of Rosie as well, and so I just had Charley. And I did a trek the trek I did just with Charley in 2016 I got sick. I walked from Cowra to Healesville, and I got sick at the end of it, quite sick. And I had to leave her behind. And so Charley is actually still in Victoria. And I've just moved back to northern New South Wales, which is where that's the home. The only way home was northern New South Wales. But now this is I expect to see my life out here now. But I'd love to have Charley back. But I'm in more of a valley now, and I know that it's not probably not the right climate for her. Not the mud that's so bad when it rains heavily, the lush growth, and right now she's on 100 acres. She's got the company of some horses, and it's in really dry country in Mansfield in Victoria. So I still haven't let her go. I still kind of go through, is there a way I can bring her here? Now I've got a permanent home, because in the 4 years since I got sick, I had this health crisis, and a whole lot of things happened, and I couldn't have her any time then. But now I have the space to have her. I've now got to make the decision. And I haven't quite made it yet, which is also part of, I think, having trouble letting go of my trekking gear, because maybe I will bring her. So that's all. I feel very up in the air still about all that.
Okay, and one final question on the donkeys. You were doing the Bicentennial National Trail. This is a shared trail that was designed to take horses and hikers and by default cyclists as well. Did the fact that you were travelling with donkeys actually force you into specific directions? I mean, did you come across sections where animals weren't allowed, or was it a reasonably steady and expected sort of route?
No, it was accessible for donkeys virtually all the way. That trail was actually established. It was an initiative of R.M. Williams. It was an initiative of his. He wanted some people to create a track that could be ridden by a horse from Cooktown to Healesville. That was the length of the Great Divide, basically, what he was wanting. So it was really created primarily with horses in mind. So taking donkeys on that was not difficult, not at all difficult in that sense. But during a particularly challenging navigation section, so challenging that this was, for 6 days, I actually had someone come with me because I knew it was beyond me to manage. It was the Han tableland. And I realised then how difficult it was to do difficult navigation on foot with 2 donkeys, because trying to follow a compass bearing, which is what I had to do because we just had these guidebooks to give us the instructions, and walk through long grass that's then scattered with rocks. Yes, the donkeys walking on their own would have no difficulty, but I needed them to walk where I wanted to walk in order to maintain my compass bearing. And because I'm not good at navigation, someone else wouldn't get lost so quickly, but I'd get lost really quickly. So, and what I realised is, if you're on a horse, it'd be so different, because where you look, the horse will go.
Yeah.
So you're up nice and high. And I realised that was interesting to realise that as far as navigation went in those difficult kind of terrain, walking with donkeys was about the hardest. If you're riding a donkey, it would be easier, but not when you're walking.
All right. Now, moving on from the donkeys specifically, let's talk about logistical issues. So, and I know there's probably no one answer here, but how did you approach each day? Take us through from the start of a day to the end of the day as a typical sort of thing anyway.
Okay, I have to try and think about somewhere, I think. Okay, I slept in my tent. So I would wake in the morning around 4. Although, as it got hotter, I made sure I was up and awake by 3. And I would usually do 45 minutes to an hour's meditation. It really kind of settled my being for the day.
Yep.
And then I'd do that in my tent, just rolling up my saddle blankets in the way I said. Then it would be, and I would have my breakfast soaking from the night before. So I would use various sorts of grain and dried fruit that I either have cooked. So let's say I've cooked quinoa the night before. Rarely did I sit to eat breakfast, which is always a bit silly. But anyway, rarely I did, because I would always do it while I'm pulling the tent down, so I just have the bowl and spoon there and take spoonfuls while I'm packing up.
Yeah.
Because packing up, breaking camp was a slow process with one person, because I've got the donkeys on a tether, like a sidelining rope as a rule. Sometimes there were places where the donkeys could free range, but if there was no free ranging, they were on a tether. So all of the ropes have got to be wound up and wrapped properly so that everything is easy to get out again. I would generally not get to have a cup of tea, which is something I always regretted, that I could never seem to manage to make a cup of tea in the mornings. But I would have a cup of tea later. I would just I would was boil the water, fill my thermos flask so I could actually have tea a bit later in the morning when I stopped.
Yep.
And packing up and then I've got to pack everything into the saddlebags. And the key, as far as I was concerned, just packing the donkeys, was having each side of the saddlebags, each side on the saddle, absolutely equal. And so once again, because of my ability to estimate, that was actually quite handy, my capacity to kind of pack each saddlebag with everything, and then make sure that it was exactly the same. I found when I had oranges, that was always very useful. I wouldn't always have them because I would run out of them. I would only buy those when I could get them fresh. But right at the end, to make them the saddlebags exactly even, I could distribute my oranges, which is always a help to do that. And then finally my biggest challenge, then it was harnessing the donkeys with the saddles. And then my biggest challenge of the day was getting those saddlebags on, because they were each, 30 to 35 kilos. Sorry, not each.
A pair.
Yeah, but each is nearly 20 kilos, something, getting close to that. Say 18 kilos. Yeah, probably that's what they were usually. Still, to lift that, and for me to lift an 18 kilo pack and hook it onto the saddle on one side, and then hold that while I run around the other side and hook the other one on before the first side slipped was really, I mean, the donkeys were wonderful. I would kind of line the packs up. I would put one pack down on the ground on one side of the donkey and the other one on the other side of the donkey. And they absolutely knew, they were so good about that. And by the way, when in the early stages, if I would pull the girth strap too tight or something, Grace seemed to put up with anything. But Charley, the first time I had her, I couldn't realize what was going on. I got the pack saddle on her and she rolled on the ground. What's going on here? And then I realised, she's telling me she's uncomfortable. I said, well, get up and I'll try again. So she got up and I tried again. I could see I'd actually put the girth in slightly the wrong spot.
Yeah.
It was hurting her. So the donkeys communicate. Instead of just running away because they're upset, they actually try and communicate. And so finally we get the saddlebags on, and everything's lovely and even, and it worked so well that people used to tell me before I did this trek that donkeys are really hard to load because of their shape, and that you're all forever adjusting the pack saddle because it'll slip. Well, I can tell you my pack saddle never slipped, not even a couple of times when the donkeys actually fell going up a steep slope or something like that.
Yeah.
Just didn't budge. So the secret was absolutely exactly the same, exactly down to an orange, making it the same. And for that reason also, I carried everything that I needed for the day, like my food that I was going to, I was going to use that up, and my thermos flask in my backpack.
All right, so you by the sound of it, the getting ready in the morning and getting packed up is probably one of the most difficult things. What time did you try and be away from your campsite? And I know this is going to vary from day to day, but did you try and get away by a particular time?
I gave up on trying to get away by a particular time, and was frustrated for a hell of a long time at how long it took me to load in the morning. And when it got very hot, all I could do was go for not walking after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So I would work it out to try and do that. But I was never very good at leaving at a particular time. I'm very, very disciplined about getting up at a particular time, but leaving at a particular time it just took as long as it took. That's sort of how it was. So we would set off, and sometimes I didn't even eat breakfast. I would stick that in my backpack, and then we'd just have a stop, about 10 o'clock or something, and eat my breakfast. It depends. If it was going to be a long day, I would often do that because I generally only ate sort of twice in the day. And so usually, we had a stop at around somewhere between 10 and 11. In fact, at first I only ever had Grace in front, but once I sort of coaxed Charley into taking the lead as well, when she was in the lead, at around about, if a shady tree appeared any time between 10 and 11, she would head for it. It's like, we can stop here. Look at this lovely shady tree, and this is the time we can stop. So in some ways, the donkeys were better at time than I was around these things, which I found quite funny. So yes, we would stop. I would hope for a shady spot where we could sit, and I could have several. I enjoyed having several cups of tea. Cup of tea was totally my balm, if you like, to any kind of stress. Mostly green tea, but I carried a variety of teas. In fact, usually later, if I could have a cup of tea later in the day, it would be a really strong black tea. And that's what I would also enjoy. So then if we were lucky, we'd stop somewhere for lunch around maybe 1-ish or something like that. So I kind of usually managed to walk, like what I was going for was 3 hours walking in the morning, 1 hour stop for lunch, and the 3 hours in the morning plus, I suppose, a half an hour stop, right, for a break. Then a 1 hour stop at lunchtime, and then 2 hours in the afternoon was what I was going for. Because what I was always trying to do, and I'm sort of putting my hand over my face and in frustration because it so often didn't work, was to actually be set up, completely set up, and eating my dinner before dark.
Yeah, I must admit it's something I try to do even from a walking perspective. It's just nice to not have to worry about setting up when it's pitch black. It makes it so much easier.
That's right. And the trouble was that I just could never get, when it was full camp, because sometimes I was able to avoid setting up a tent for various reasons, because quite often, as you will have read, in the middle of the trek, I actually stayed, middle and later trek, I stayed in workers' cottages and things like that at the cattle stations. But as long as I was setting up full camp, I could not do breaking and setting up camp, got those two things done the wrong way, breaking and setting up camp in less than 5 hours.
Yeah.
It took 5 hours every day when I was on my own. And when I mentioned I had a friend with me for those 6 days. And of course, the obvious, when she was there, it was less than half the time with two people. And it was just, I had this unrealistic, I found it really, really difficult to accept how long it took to break and set up camp. I struggled with that for a long time. Sort of like, I should be able to do it faster.
All right, so let's move on to gear now. In relation to, you were saying you've got pack animals and you were saying you were trying to go as light as possible. Were you just using what you had in relation to hiking gear, or did you buy anything specifically that was for you rather than the donkeys for this trip?
Oh, no, I was able to use virtually everything that I had by way of hiking gear, yeah. My little stove, my pots, my good cooking pots. I can't think of anything that I had to buy especially, and that was sort of, and in a way, it's a reflection of how much I was able to draw on my experience.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing. It wasn't if you were learning how to hike, you knew how to do that, and you obviously had the gear from all the years, so it was a matter of deciding whether you had what you specifically wanted rather than what you necessarily needed.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, now, at the trip of this sort of length, I mean, this is a long trip by any means, and certainly from an Australian perspective, short of doing a walk around Australia, the Bicentennial National Trail is the biggest trail that we have, and you did roughly just on 2,500 kilometres. So that's a big trip. What were the physical challenges from your perspective that you found on this trip?
The physical challenges were mainly in the beginning, and I knew that would be the case just from my trekking in Nepal. You get fit, you get tough, your body toughens. I remember the first day is still really clear to me. The first day out of Cooktown was all on Bitumen Road. Oh my God, mate.
No, that's not a favourite of mine either.
Yeah, and that meant also I had to walk facing the traffic. So I had to walk on the same side of the donkeys all day.
Yeah.
So my shot, not only did I have, sore feet and ankles, which you'll get when you walk on bitumen, but I had, every joint was aching, it felt like, by the time I finished that day. But really, maybe you can remind me from what you've read. I don't recall really any major physical challenges much after the first couple of weeks. Yeah.
Okay, well, what about the mental challenges? And again, this is one of the things that long-distance hikers often struggle with, is whether to go alone or whether to hike with somebody else. And you did have companionship with the donkeys, but they're not going to hold an in-depth conversation with you on a regular basis. So how did you find being alone? And again, you were staying at stations and talking to people, but I mean, this was a long trip where you would have spent a lot of it in your own mind, in your own thoughts. How did you find that the mental challenge of being alone for such a long time?
Well, that I regarded as an opportunity because I've done many years of meditation. And it's very different, as anyone who's a long-term meditator knows, from the mind state that one has in a retreat, and then you come back out into the world, and my God, what happened to this wonderful mind state I had in the retreat?
Yep.
So what I knew was that this would be the opportunity to practice, bring my meditation practice off my cushion and into walking. So I really didn't look for company at all. I'm not someone who... I can certainly manage with my own company. I've got lots of experiences and skills, I guess, to be with my own company. And in fact, the whole thing about the social thing, you will recall, was actually... The social challenges were actually the biggest major challenge of the walk, because I ended up having to rely on cattle stations, which was never part of my plan. Never. I had it all set up so I could be independent. But the drought was such that on the Bicentennial Trail is these designated campsites.
Yep.
But so much of it, especially through Queensland, is through private property. So you're not supposed to camp anywhere but where it's been agreed with the property owners.
Yeah.
But I couldn't camp at most of those places because there was no water and no feed for the donkeys.
Yeah. It works wonderfully when you can get it. You've got your water with you and your food, and that's all you have to worry about. But when you've got stock with you, it's a different situation. Yeah.
I had to. They needed feed, and so it was. So it ended up. I would have to. I ended up having to phone ahead to let the station people know I was coming through, to ask them if there was water at a particular stop, and invariably the answer was no. Well, what about feed? No, they just laughed. Or because if there was water, there was no feed.
Yeah.
Because that's where the cattle spent the night. So there was absolutely no feed. And I tried at first asking them, doing the very city thing and asking them how much they charged to drop me off some water and some feed. But it's a different culture out there, different world. It's like, no, come to the homestead. And so that's what I ended up having to do quite a lot. And I didn't really want to do that because, well, for a start, a vegetarian in cattle country is odd. I can tell you that. And what I gradually began to realise was that they expected some sort of entertainment. I just don't have those sorts of skills.
Yeah. I suppose for them, you were unique. Telling your stories and what you'd been through is something different for them. But sometimes all you want to do is just go and lay down and go to sleep.
Yes, I was this novelty that they wanted to kind of exploit. I don't mean that in any harsh way, but so the challenges for me were very much social, and I absolutely didn't expect that. I was expecting more physical challenges.
Yeah.
But it was almost as if my karma, or whatever you want to call it, was saying, "No, been there, done that." The only physical challenge, real challenge, actually was trying to maintain my weight. I got thinner and thinner. And it didn't matter how much I ate. I couldn't keep my weight on, which was which was a bit of a nuisance, because I knew when under a certain weight, I could tell my energy levels dropped. So that was difficult. But it was, and I met some incredibly interesting people as well. But it was the personal challenge, the inner challenge of just dealing with myself. And this is what you do when you bring your meditation practice into life, then it's about really and truly dealing with oneself and whatever's going on inside of oneself and accepting it for what it is.
Okay, now one of the questions that I often get asked, and this is without being sexist, I get a lot of females saying, "What about personal safety?" Was that ever a worry for you, or is this something that you'd been walking for so long in relation to bushwalking, you just didn't think about having any issues there at all?
I certainly didn't think about having any issues, partly because my childhood was such that where I wasn't safe was in my own home, and the first place in the world that I felt totally safe was in the bush.
Yeah.
So for me, being out there, even as a younger woman, like when I used to go running and things like that at night, I just knew, that there's nothing out there to be scared of. It's where it's scary is at home. So I can see that now as the upside of actually what happened to me as a child, is I just don't have the same fears that someone else might of being on my own, in strange environments, I guess.
Yep.
And the people used to, particularly women, often ask me, wasn't I scared? And so at first it sort of vaguely irritated me that so many women thought immediately of something scary. I just thought that was quite sad. But so I started to answer, well, what should I be scared of? And they'd say, well, what about being attacked? And my answer was, well, I've come from a city. Where do you think I'm most likely to be faced with an attacker? In the centre of Sydney at night, or out here? And kind of agree and realise the city. And then I'd say, well, but what if you have an accident and there's no one there? Well, I'm much less likely to have an accident than most people around here. Oh, why is that? Well, that's because I'm on foot. I'm not driving a car. Most accidents, I would presume, occur because in a car.
Yeah.
Not on foot. Yeah. So.
Okay. Now, from a positive perspective, what really stood out for you on this trip? I mean, you mentioned the travelling with the donkeys as a highlight. You talked about your interactions with people, but what was the real highlight of this trip for you?
Yeah, the willingness of people to help out was certainly a highlight, because it was quite remarkable how much people put themselves out. But it had its cost. I was looking for independence, And I suppose you could say, as a highlight, was what I learnt was about interdependence instead of independence.
Yeah.
I wanted to be a human island. Instead, what I learnt was what it really meant to be a wanderer. That as a wanderer, I had no home. And I was like a wanderer, even though I might have been walking from A to B. I was still a wanderer through other people's country, if you like. Country in the sense that the Aboriginal people would talk about.
Yeah.
So I didn't belong, and learning the importance of respecting the people who did feel they belonged to that land. So I think what I learnt was were the highlights, all the things that I learnt, and there was so much. And I would go take that to be is more important than the to think.
Yep.
Because one of the things about, I've been practicing meditation for a long, long time now, and to just know that we are not our thoughts, that thoughts come and go at their own, it's got nothing to do with us. We actually don't have no control over them whatsoever.
Yeah.
So to just be aware of those thoughts as part of a passing parade, which I was always able to do in a retreat, but somehow or other back in the world, they would grab me again as if they're real and important. Some thoughts occasionally are important, but mostly they're not.
No.
Yeah, to actually then recognise that the shoulds that I had were only thoughts as well. And so, I guess that was one of the highlights, was the point at which I could let go of the shoulds, the should that I should arrive at a campsite at a certain time. I should get packed up or be able to break camp or pack up in a certain length of time.
All right, so we'll move on now to the last point of discussion, and that's the book that you've released earlier this year called The Only Way Home. And for those people listening to this podcast, I'll provide a link in the show notes. As this podcast is released, we'll also have a written review of the book. It's there are some very good stories, and from my perspective, this is one of the books that I've most enjoyed reading over the last year or so. It's a good story, and it's a well written book you just want to read. So, tell us a bit about the book. Was it your plan to write a book prior to this trip, or is this something that came out of the trip itself?
No. I didn't plan to write a book, that was for sure. I did plan to write a journal. I'm not normally a journal writer, but somehow or other I thought I would want to write the story probably for myself and maybe even for hopefully that my children would read it as well.
Yeah.
It was part of that, But to actually write a book, no. But so what I did was I wrote the story of the trek. I did that. I probably had it finished, I think, around 2006, because I did keep really good journal notes. So every day, no matter how tired, I had this really small notebook. I would write some notes, like just absolutely just notes of that day, and there mightn't be more than 3 sentences. Or a dozen words. But I did that every day. And then and I didn't plan this just kind of worked gradually. Then I would stop to restock about every 3 to 4 weeks. And then that's when I learned that, this is how I need to do it. I would also spend time at those stops. I would stop for maybe 5 days, usually. That's what I gradually did, and write up my journal. And what was remarkable was how I could look back at those daily notes, and each day was enough to remember that day. So it was really, I was quite amazed at that. Obviously, if I looked at it a year later, I wouldn't have. But it was only, 3 or 4 weeks. I'd go back and look at each day and write it up. So basically, I wrote up these journals, and then probably by about the end of 2006, I had written the story. I sent it to an author I knew to say, how do you like this? Would you have a read? And he wrote back and said, yeah, it's great. He said, it's almost publishable with a bit of work. I was, wow, okay. But that was a surprise because, yes, I'm a writer. I've been a writer for a long time. I write for work, but it's academic writing. I'd never tackled anything like this as writing about myself. So I was delighted when Malcolm said what he did. But he said, if you want to make it publishable, which I didn't think I did, but still, you're going to have to talk about why you did the trek. I'm like, I said, that means that's my whole life. He said,
yep.
You better get started, hadn't you? Oh, right. Okay. So even then, the notion of it being publishable, I just started at that point to think, well, what I'd like is for it to be, with Malcolm's kind of encouragement, I'd like it to be good enough that my descendants would like to read it. And obviously, you're not going to write your read your great-great-grandmother's story when you don't know her, if it's not well written.
Yep.
So I knew it had to be written. In order to achieve that, it had to be written at a kind of publishing standard, So I was going to keep on working on my writing. So, yes, so that was the point at which, yes, I had the trek written. I then wrote about my life to the extent, all the parts of it that seemed to come together to lead to my doing this trek. And then the question was, and then I sent that to Malcolm too, he said, well, okay, so now can you weave them together? And you see, I love a challenge. I like physical challenges and I like intellectual challenges. So I said, right, okay, well, I'll give it a try. And it was once I started to weave it together, that's when the actual healing process started somehow. Until then, I was just kind of writing. I'd done a lot of, I felt as if I'd gained so much from the trek about what I'd learnt. I thought I was ready. I think you know from reading the book, I ended up using this trek as my transition from 40 years of marriage to living solo. So I felt when I finished the trek, I had achieved that. So I guess that's a highlight too, all right? I did feel as if I was ready to do that. But my life was very complex and difficult and full of trauma. So it was actually, I had no idea how, especially from all of my years of meditation, how valuable writing was from the perspective of healing. So that was what the next, how many years is all that is, I've run out of counting, say from about 2008 to, so 10 years of writing and rewriting, and things that came up that I would remember, that I never thought of, that were important. And the healing just kept on going through that period. And I never felt really sure that I was ready to publish, like in the sense of ready to tell my story, the story of my life. And yes, I was happy to tell a story of my trek, but the trouble is that the truth was, the story of my life, it didn't make sense except in the context of my life.
Yep.
When was I going to be ready to tell that story and release it to the public, even if it was good enough to publish? And when I finally became ready was when in last year, when one of my daughters had been flooding me with material about the effect of trauma on the brain. And I just read, and finally I got it. I understood the effect of complex trauma on my brain in a really fundamental way of why. It explained almost everything about my behaviour and my decisions. So once I incorporated that, right, okay, I'm ready to let it go now. And because you see, I wasn't ready before because I had secrets. And the trouble with secrets are always associated with shame, or it's not a secret. You don't need to keep something secret unless it's shameful.
Yeah.
In some way. So I was able to then reveal my secrets because I'm no longer ashamed, because I understand that I'm the person I am today as a result of a really difficult life, and all this really foolish ways and apparently insane ways I seem to behave could all be explained. And yet in the end, they've got me to today where I can actually tell my story in a coherent way.
I know writing books is not a quick and dirty sort of process. I mean, I know the full-on professional writers will often knock out a book in a year, but for most people, as you say, it tends to be done over a period of years. And as you write things, your perspective changes, and you rewrite and you change things. And it sounds like a journey in itself, writing the book, just as much as undertaking the actual trip itself.
Absolutely, Tim. Because what it comes down to for me, that in that book are three journeys. There's the journey of the trek. There's the journey of my life as it led to the trek, and then there's the journey of writing and healing, and writing and healing, and writing. That, and I think now by the time it was finished, it is written from the perspective of me in my mid-70s. But because I started writing so long ago, the actual factual memories have all been captured quite well.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's... and I feel totally blessed that someone recognised the value of it and published it. I have to say, thank you to Woodland Press. I am very grateful.
Okay, now one final question. Having completed your trip in 2004, if you were to go back and do the same trip again, would you have done things differently, or is the way it happened pretty much the way you would still do it?
Oh, well, I couldn't not learn, could I? There's so much I could learn from what I did from that, you know. Imagine doing it now when I wouldn't get impatient with the donkeys just because I wanted to walk faster. You know? I wouldn't be shooting on myself about I should be able to pack up quicker because I can only pack up as fast as I can pack up. That's all. I can only set up camp as fast as I can set it up. I'm not mucking around. It takes as long as it takes. So all those shoulds, and it's actually a bit difficult to imagine how it would be now, really, if I were to try and do it again. Because I am a wiser and, despite being older, I think stronger person than I was when I did the trek.
All right, that's good to hear. So we've been talking to Liz Byron about her unique journey on the Bicentennial National Trail. To find out more, read our review on her book on the Australian Hiker website. And Liz, thank you for your time.
And thank you, Tim.
Okay, so as we mentioned, this was a longer podcast than we typically do for a one-person interview, but I must admit I found this story to be really interesting in a number of different levels. And first up, I'll go a bit backwards here in some respects. This all started out with doing a book review and thinking this would make a really good podcast. But the book itself, which we've done a separate review of, and the link is in the show notes for that, is a really interesting book. It's a non-fiction book, and a lot of books I find that tend to be telling stories of journeys. Sometimes they can be a bit academic based, and they tend to lose interest partway through. This one was a very interesting read.
Yeah, I think sometimes books they go one of two directions. One is this is how I put my foot one in front of the other, and so it's very sort of retelling the steps in a very specific way, or it becomes very inwardly focused and fixated on my growth and how I feel and all of those sorts of things. And I think this book's quite different to that.
I think it does actually get a good balance. I mean, in talking to Liz when she was talking about doing her first rough draft of this, she said it was really a story about the trip without the backstory. And that backstory was needed to provide the context for why Liz was doing this trip. And it's not often that people plan on doing potentially anything up to a 9 months trip. And this one ended up being just a bit over 7 months. But there was reasons for Liz wanting to do this trip apart from something she enjoyed doing. And that's all very well detailed and outlined in the book itself. So, as I said, the book itself has so many interesting stories that we didn't even touch on in the interview. It's well worth the read, and particularly early on in the book, Liz talks about the whole arduous task of initially getting the donkeys onto a horse float, and there was actually 11 of them in total, including her two, it's. You tend to assume that they're just small horses, and they're definitely not. So there are some very good stories in through there. Going on to the donkeys in particular, and again, this is what makes this story stand out a bit. The Bicentennial National Trail is roughly about 5,300 kilometres. And if you go online to the website and see the people who have identified as having done the trip, there really isn't that many. Now, that's probably for a couple of reasons. The trail came about in 1988 before websites were even in existence or very common. So there was obviously a number of people that have done this who were prior to the website going online. It's a really long trip, and it was... It's a
lot of time to commit.
It's a lot of time to commit. People seem to take that sort of 6 to 12 months to do it in most cases. It is, even though it's a shared trail designed to be used for hikers and for horses in particular, it's more about the horse side of things than it is about the people side of things, because it really is geared on management roads and areas where horses are allowed to go through. So, if it was purely a foot trail, it might be a very different trail. So I think the trail itself, at least from my perspective and in talking to Liz, was really just wallpaper on the trip itself. It was a backdrop to the trip rather than being the centrepiece of the trip. Certainly the centrepiece for me was the relationship between Liz and her donkeys, and it was just that. She, in a number of times, talked about the relationship being a partnership, whereas, you tell a horse what to do and it does it, whereas donkeys, you've got to really have their agreement and they've got to trust in you to actually do what you're asking them to do and trust that you're not putting them in danger. So it was quite interesting to hear that relationship, and she obviously did care quite a lot about the donkeys, and it was really obvious that the relationship was there between them.
And she hadn't had donkeys before.
No, and it's one of those sort of things where she did actually, coming back to the whole reason for taking the donkeys was, she was 60 when she did this trip. She had gotten to the stage where she realised she was unable to do a trip of that length and carry a full pack, and pack animals were definitely the way to go, and donkeys seemed the logical sort of choice. She ended up taking 2 donkeys because even though they were capable of carrying more, she didn't want to put any more than a maximum of 50 kilos on an animal. And she ended up, by the sound of it, having roughly about 70 kilos approximately between the 2 donkeys. So that would have been a pretty big load for just one animal. She started off with the whole concept of want to do the trip. Donkeys is the logical way to do this. Now she'll start the planning side of things. The planning to a great extent was based around the donkey. She had all her own equipment, it was all relatively lightweight, but trying to find pack saddles and all the equipment for donkeys, it sounded almost a bit like divine intervention, where just as she started looking for pack saddles for her donkeys, they appeared in one of the donkey magazines just at the right time, and she managed to pick these things up rather than having to get them made or try and get them from overseas, which would have been a bit of a nightmare. I think it was interesting, and it was a conversation I had with Liz prior to the interview, and we didn't talk about it in the interview, but she said, really, when you think about the relationship between the comparison between horses and donkeys to people, she said, and I'm sure a lot of people who are horse people will probably disagree with this.
You'll be in trouble in a minute, I think.
She was saying that when you compare horses to people, horses have got the mentality of about a 3-year-old, where donkeys have got the mentality of a 13-year-old. And I think there's probably pros and cons on that. Trying to get a 13-year-old adolescent to do things you want them to do sounds exactly like a donkey. It'll only do something that it really wants to do. She just, in the book itself, she really just gives example after example of things that you just wouldn't expect out of a pack animal, to be able to do and to be able to help out with the trip. So it was actually quite amazing. There were some very interesting stories through there. The whole concept of the trip, she ended up not completing the full trip she'd planned to. She was going to start in Cooktown and finish at her home, and she didn't quite get there. She probably had about a month to go, and this was tied in with the sale of a house. She had an issue with saddle sore on one of the donkeys in particular. This was Grace. She looked at getting a third donkey, and she actually ended up getting a third donkey, and adding one donkey to a pair of donkeys just didn't work. The relationship wasn't there. They obviously needed time to get used to each other and build a relationship, and it was a bit hard. So she did end up finishing the trip earlier than planned, but still covered roughly around about 2,500 kilometres, which is pretty impressive. I think the whole thing from Liz's point of view, one of the highlights she talked about was she intended to do this trip by herself with the donkeys and not rely on anybody else. And because of the time she did it, where Australia was in the middle of probably one of their worst droughts in a long time, and particularly in that area of Queensland, there was either no water, or if there was water, there was no feed. And so while it was okay if you're a camper to carry water with you and to have your own food, it's a bit hard when you've got pack animals. So for a lot of the time, she ended up staying in homesteads of the properties that she went through.
Yeah, this is interesting because that wasn't her intent at all, was it?
No, it wasn't her intent, and I think it gave her a different experience than what she thought she'd end up with. It's, if you can imagine doing a long day's hike, all you want to do after a hard day is just go to bed, and you've got someone who's been gracious enough to invite them into their home and will feed you and give you somewhere to stay, but in return they want to talk to you about what you're doing and hear your story. And sometimes some people don't necessarily fit into that mould. It's almost a bit like your light entertainment. That sort of stuff doesn't particularly worry me, but again, it's really horses for courses, and you've got to be the sort of individual that's happy about doing that.
Yeah, because it's a big deal. I mean, what she was saying was that she would phone, the local homestead to find out about water and those sorts of things, and probably mostly there was none, and in appreciation of what she was doing, they would invite her in and say, you have to stay with us tonight and be our guest. And that did mean that you had to be a little bit sociable, a little bit upbeat about the whole thing. And, it's a two-way thing. And she was probably in need of a bit of company at some point too, I think. It wasn't probably a one-way street.
And I think about also, saying to someone in the middle of cattle country that I'm a vegetarian as well.
You're what?
Yeah, so I think it as I said, for me, this was a really interesting story. I was really glad I had a chance to talk to Liz, and it was a really interesting book to read as well. So I think if you have the opportunity, go through, get a hold of the book. And I think even if you're not a hiker, it's a really interesting story and it's well worthwhile looking at. I think it's also, the other thing that really stood out for me on this is that I realise at some point, whether it's 10, 20, 30 years down the track, when I get to the stage of can I do the big trips that I want to do, rather than saying, well, no, I can't, I just have to stop this altogether, about looking at alternatives. Are pack animals an alternative? Not always the case. I mean, you're not always able to take them into national parks, but at least it does give you an option and an alternative. And Liz, from Liz's perspective, she had no experience at all prior to planning this trip. She got the donkeys, she learned how to work with them, how to manage them, and build the relationship before she started the walk. So that was a really interesting concept through there. Okay, we hope you've enjoyed this episode. And as I said, go through and have a look at the book review. And if you're looking at an interesting book to read, definitely one worth thinking about. If you have the opportunity, please go through and give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or the podcast listener of your choice. And let people know about this podcast if they've got an interest in something just a bit unique. That's all for me. Bye for now.
And bye from me.